Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Allison Henline. I am not Shaker History as my nameplate here says. My name is Allison Henline. I am the Educator and Outreach Manager at the Shaker Historical Society. And I am joined tonight by our guest speaker and our digital humanities consultant for this oral history project that his talk is kind of talking about tonight, Dr. Mark Souther of CSU. So Dr. Souther is the director of the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at Cleveland State University, and he's going to be exploring the broader history behind planning principles that define Shaker Heights. So he's going to be giving us this wonderful presentation. I ask that if you have any questions or comments at all at any point during this presentation to just type them into the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we will be asking questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it on over to Dr. Souther.
Thanks very much, Allison, and thanks for everyone who's here. What do Lakeview Cemetery, Rockefeller Park, and Shaker Heights share in common? All three are very different types of places, a cemetery, a park, and a suburb, but they all arose from a common 19th century urban vision. This common vision, embodied by the ideal of the so-called middle landscape, had its origins in the ambivalence that many Americans felt towards cities. Americans in the late 18th and early 19th centuries tended to regard cities as failing to provide a conducive environment for good life and good citizenship. Like Thomas Jefferson, they tended to view the agrarian life of farmers as the basis for national and civic virtue, as well as physical and moral health. But in the second quarter of the 19th century, these ideas began to transform. As the historian David Schuyler argued in his book, The New Urban Landscape, Americans developed a new sentimentalism toward nature, one that was less interested in rural areas as cradles of virtue than in aesthetic considerations. The emerging view by the 1830s was that Americans should craft a middle landscape that was neither wilderness nor city, but instead a cultivated naturalistic landscape. This middle landscape had a range of influences, including country estates. Jefferson's Monticello, like so-called country seats elsewhere that were owned by wealthy white Americans, borrowed aesthetically from English country gardens. And here's just one example of many, Stowe Gardens, seen here around 1760. Some of the earliest expressions of the middle landscape were actually cemeteries, which might be surprising. The rural cemetery movement originated in 1831 with Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge near Boston, which was the brainchild of Boston physician and botanist Jacob Bigelow. Rural cemeteries got their start because they were located on what were, in the 19th century, still the rural fringes of cities, usually on high knolls that afforded sweeping vistas of the city in the distance. Mount Auburn was the template, with its curvilinear streets that followed the contour of the land, lush plantings of ornamental trees and shrubs, and beautiful views of the city. At a time when people believed in the importance of fresh air and open space for health, it doubled as both burial ground and parkland. And it influenced many other city cemeteries over the next few decades, including Brooklyn's Greenwood and, of course, Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery. The middle landscape also drew upon the ideas of Andrew Jackson Downing, a landscape designer and horticulturist, and the son of a wheelwright turned nurseryman in Newburgh, New York. Downing wrote beginning in the 1840s on the virtues of an idealized rural architecture and landscape gardening. He shared with earlier agrarian advocates a belief that naturalistic landscapes brought out the best in people. Downing prepared an early plan for the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 1851, but Congress thought it was too expensive to implement and took no action. He was also the first to propose a Central Park for New York, but he died in a tragic steamboat fire on the Hudson River aboard the Henry Clay in 1852, and his vision went with him. No one shaped the emerging city planning vision more in the mid-19th century than the Connecticut-born journalist and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted, who was actually a protege of Downing. In 1858, he and the English-born architect and landscape designer Calvert Vaux, and it's V-A-U-X, which would seem to be Vaux, but he was born in England, and so he anglicized his name, hence Vaux, won a design competition for a new Central Park in New York City with their entry titled Greensward. The design, whose implementation Olmsted oversaw, transformed 780 acres in the middle of Manhattan, which was still in the outer periphery of New York's urbanized area, despite its name Central Park. Olmsted envisioned this park as being a place where all New Yorkers might come together and, with the calming effect of beautiful nature, might find social harmony. Entire books have been written about the design of Central Park. So for our purposes, I just want to summarize what I see as 5 key features that I think you'll pick up on as I list them in this slide. First, the thick planting of trees around the perimeter to screen out the city. I think you can see that in this corner of Central Park. Second, the creation of long inward-looking vistas to create a sense of expansiveness. You can see a couple of examples in the middle. Third, the accentuation of natural features like rock outcroppings through careful plantings and beautification of man-made ones like the city's waterworks reservoir, not as evident in this image, but nonetheless present in the park. And fourth, curvilinear bridle and footpaths to break away from the city's street grid and to suggest nature. And that's very evident here. Finally, fifth, I think it's important to note the sunken transverse roads that facilitated east-west through traffic without interrupting the park landscape. The image that you see here is actually turned on its side. So one of those transverse roads goes right through the middle from top to bottom. It's actually moving here from west to east as it goes from top to bottom of the slide. Central Park became a national model and made Olmsted and Vaux, and later Olmsted's 2 sons, John Charles and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the premier park planning consultants over the next half century or so. In city after city, they designed parks and parkway systems to connect them. In Brooklyn, Prospect Park is another example that shows how Olmsted and Vaux set the park off from the formality of the surrounding city streets. Buffalo, New York offers one of the most complete expressions of the Olmstedian vision of a city network of parks and parkways. You can still see some of that in Buffalo today. And I think it's evident in the map with the parkways that run along major arteries to the various parks. Olmsted also trained other park planners who became influential in their own right. George Kessler was one of them. He gave Kansas City, Missouri, a similarly well-developed park and parkway system in the early 1890s, as shown here. And as a demonstration of how these design ideas actually spread nationwide, including to smaller cities, a Kansas City real estate and streetcar investor named Colonel Daniel B. Dyer was so impressed with Kessler's parkway system that he tried to implement a similar plan in the early 1900s in Augusta, Georgia, where he had moved after buying and electrifying the Savannah River Valley City's street railway system in 1890. His plan failed to garner enough investment, but it did inspire beautification efforts on the city's existing wide streets, such as Green Street, which is shown in the second image on the right, which was also inspired by the 18th century planned city of Savannah, Georgia. Before drawing a line between urban parks and what I'm calling park suburbs, also often called garden suburbs, I want to briefly follow a different branch off the trunk of park planning. The urban park movement combined with the popularity of late 19th century urban expositions to help form what is known as the City Beautiful movement, which would have a huge impact on the emerging city planning profession. Most influential was the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, which introduced a new urban vision, albeit one that was also in many ways backward facing or tradition bound in terms of its architecture and conception. While Olmsted's vision for Central Park had rested on the hope that a beautiful park would inspire social harmony, the City Beautiful impulse rested instead on the hope that building a more attractive urban environment would inspire civic unity and pride and spur economic investment. Olmsted was tapped to design the grounds of the Chicago Exposition. He accepted because it was one more opportunity for him to advocate for park planning as the responsibility for trained experts. But he would be dismayed because his interest in naturalistic landscapes was overshadowed by the exposition's architect, Daniel Burnham of Chicago, who insisted on monumental neoclassical architecture. The exposition centered on the Court of Honor, which had a large reflecting pool surrounded by classically inspired buildings, faced with intricately sculpted white plaster, which lent it the nickname the White City. This vision, with its geometrical lines, looked more like the formal gardens at Versailles and Paris than the naturalistic English country gardens that Olmsted preferred. The White City was, in every sense, a model city. The fair suggested the need to strive for better city design in actual cities, and Burnham became the preeminent figure that cities around the US consulted to design exposition-inspired city plans. In 1902, following congressional enabling legislation co-sponsored by US Senator James McMillan of Michigan, Burnham got the opportunity to build upon the original 1791 plan of Washington, D.C. by Pierre Charles L'Enfant. L'Enfant had laid out the capital city with broad boulevards and large open spaces, but many of these remained poorly developed. The US Senate Park Commission, or better known as the McMillan Commission, which included in its ranks Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., oversaw this planning. The intent of the commission was modest at first, but Burnham, in keeping with the famous quote attributed to him, "Make no small plans, they have no magic to stir men's blood," convinced his fellow commissioners to go big. He headed the creation of the McMillan Plan of 1902. The McMillan Plan recommended a redesigned mall surrounded by grouped buildings amid landscaped gardens, a new Union Railroad station away from the mall itself, a memorial bridge over the Potomac River, a system of parkways, and plans to wipe out what were considered slums in what's now called the Federal Triangle between Pennsylvania Avenue and the mall. Adding to the Chicago Exposition, the McMillan Plan sparked nationwide interest in comprehensive city planning. The motivation to take up city planning involved a desire to attract business investment and to reassert elite authority over the urban masses that had shown their strength in labor organizing and strikes in recent years. You can think about Haymarket in 1886 as an example. But placing so much trust in experts and plans, City Beautiful advocates set people up for a lot of disappointment when these plans proved hard or even impossible to afford to implement at scale. Nevertheless, Burnham made plans for a number of cities, including here in Cleveland, whose group plan in 1903 created a smaller version of the DC Mall that by 1925 was surrounded by imposing and beautiful buildings like the Cleveland Public Library, Federal Courthouse, County Courthouse, City Hall, and Public Auditorium. Along with parks, park systems, and City Beautiful plans, the urban park movement gave rise to another phenomenon, the park suburb. The park suburb, or residential park, or garden suburb, it really goes by a number of names, borrowed aesthetically from rural cemeteries and urban parks. It included their curvilinear streets and their emphasis on creating a middle landscape. The earliest of these, Llewellyn Park in New Jersey, came so early, before Central Park was even completed, that it helps us, or before the plan was even completed, that it helps us see that the more general interest in the middle landscape was one that pervaded landscape design of all types, rather than moving along a linear path from country estate to rural cemetery to urban park to park suburb. Llewellyn Park located 13 miles or so west of Manhattan, opened in 1857. But the initial planning for it predated the Central Park Plan, as I had said. Its developer was the New York City druggist Llewellyn Haskell. Did not borrow from Olmsted so much, but did, like Olmsted, draw inspiration from the work of Andrew Jackson Downing, as well as the architect Alexander Jackson Davis, who designed some of the houses in the early development. Haskell's planned suburb put Downing's picturesque aesthetics into practice. Haskell became acquainted with one of Downing's collaborators, as I said, the architect Alexander Jackson Davis, in 1850. And it was actually Davis that introduced him in 1852 to the beautiful tract on the slope of Orange Mountain in New Jersey that would become Llewellyn Park. There they laid out curvilinear streets, of course, and what was called the Ramble, which was a commons that preserved and embellished some of the land's natural beauty for all to enjoy and use. This residential park attracted a number of high-profile residents. I bet you've heard of one of them, Thomas Edison. Olmsted and Vaux in 1869 went on, after getting underway with Central Park, to design one of the earliest planned park suburbs, Riverside, outside Chicago. It had the same curvilinear streets as Central Park, as well as park spaces and its own commuter rail station, with a commercial village to serve residents. Riverside reflected the top-down nature of this early form of planning, in that Riverside was not designed with a mix of price points or mix of homes and apartments, but as an upscale enclave of homeowners. These ideas were influential in how cities reinforced social divisions, again, somewhat ironically, given Olmsted's utopian ideal of social harmony. Over the next 5 decades, hundreds of park suburbs were developed, some inside and some beyond the city limits of US cities. Early local examples around Cleveland include Wade Park allotment and University Circle, most of which has been converted to institutional uses where houses still exist. But you can still see some of that early vision in terms of the curving streets and naturalistic sounding names such as Magnolia and Mistletoe and Bellflower. Those were some of the original names, whereas others got renamed over the years to different types of names. And the second one, not far from there, up the hill in Cleveland Heights, called Euclid Heights. So those are just a couple of local examples that predate Shaker Heights, I should say, because Shaker Heights is the obvious example that we're getting to. Beyond cultivating a middle landscape, park suburbs also came to embody a strong delineation or separation of land uses. They borrowed from emerging ideas about zoning popularized in planning circles by European innovations. Take, for example, in 1891, Frankfurt, Germany, which had divided itself into zones for different types of land uses, including 2 for residential, 2 for mixed use, and 2 for factories, each with its own density requirements. The first comprehensive zoning law in the US was actually enacted in Los Angeles in 1908, which is some 8 years before the better known one in New York City, which was more about building heights. The one in Los Angeles sought to designate residential and industrial districts and to keep those carefully delineated, which it did. A second European innovation that shaped the idea of land use regulations in park suburbs was that of London physician Ebenezer Howard. His book, Garden Cities of Tomorrow, published in 1898, advanced the concept of the garden city. Garden city plans separated different land uses into clear zones. Other features included transit-oriented villages to concentrate commerce in a convenient place rather than interspersing it with housing. And if you look closely at this idealized diagram, you can see some of the ideas associated with the garden city, which is to say that it was really a satellite city that would be on the periphery of a major city. It would have its own rail line and connect to other garden cities. And it would be surrounded by various uses such as agriculture, things like orchards and farms and pastures. And it would also be surrounded by various types of uses, such as, it says, convalescent homes, for example. So it was not uncommon in Europe and the US for those types of places that where they believed in the power of fresh air to be healing and restoring, to see those located on the periphery of urbanized areas rather than in the heart of cities themselves. So this was seen as a healthful setting. The concept of the garden city was put into practice in a number of places in Europe and in England specifically. One famous example is Letchworth Garden City, started in 1905, which had a central village that you can see in the upper left, clustered housing, which you can see both upper right and lower right. These were sort of, they called them sometimes workmen's cottages. And it had a surrounding rural belt, which you see in the lower left side of the slide. Elements of Ebenezer Howard's concept also shaped Margaret Sage's development as part of the Russell Sage Foundation of Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, New York, which started in 1909, including what's shown here, the 1912 Station Square, which was, again, that idea of the village located along transit that's also convenient for residents, so that they congregated commercial uses into one village. This concept really sort of, caught fire and went around the country in a number of places, and I wanted to show just a couple of other examples. One that is probably not familiar to many, but still exists, is Market Square in the planned suburb of Lake Forest, Illinois, which dates to 1916. And this one will be very familiar, of course, Shaker Square, completed in 1929. But this was a popular concept, and it owes a lot to the Garden City ideal. Another Garden City concept, and here we're going to sort of skip forward in time a little bit briefly to show that this idea didn't just go away. It's not something that, you've reached Shaker Heights and then the idea disappears. After Shaker Heights was well underway, Radburn, New Jersey put this into practice, and it did so much more close, following much more closely what Ebenezer Howard recommended in some respects than even Shaker Heights, which is often held up as the best example of the Garden City ideal in the US. And by that, I mean to really focus in on this idea of clustered housing and green belts. So that one of the things that Radburn did that was pretty revolutionary in the US context was to put the residential housing very close together to open up commons, basically. So instead of everyone having their private, front and backyard that was very sizable for their own enjoyment, the people themselves had very little land of their own, so that the collective whole, the community, had all that space in common to share. So they were very, communal in that way. And you can see also, if you look especially on the right side of the slide, that the houses actually faced the commons and they turned their back to the street. And I think that's what's really revolutionary from an American context. We tend to want our houses to face the street. It's maybe a status thing, but they actually turned their streets toward pedestrians rather than automobiles, and turned the automobiles backward onto a motorway that went in, connected to your garage, which is actually, very appropriately in the back of the house and not in the front, as it often has ended up so often. We could also look at other examples moving a little bit forward in time. One of these that's important was the idea of the Greenbelt town program that the federal government invested in. So just as Olmstedian planning compartmentalized park spaces into different outdoor rooms, so to speak, Garden cities were to have designated areas for commercial, industrial, residential, and institutional uses, each of which would be buffered by passive park spaces or green belts. So the green belt concept that was also used in Radburn, and of course it's used in Shaker Heights with the Shaker Lakes in particular, it also appeared in the 1930s in the Greenbelt Town program of the Resettlement Administration, which was headed by a man named Rexford Tugwell. The Greenbelt Town program actually only produced 3 Garden City influenced new towns, one outside Baltimore and Washington, one outside Cincinnati, and one just outside Milwaukee before funding lapsed. It failed to become a dominant mode really because so few developers were willing to part with the opportunity to profit directly from building on every available piece of land. And the idea of communal space was even cast by some detractors as communist, especially when the US government was involved. And in fact, some people took to calling Rexford Tugwell Rexford the Red. A select few planned suburban new towns in the 1960s, including Reston, Virginia, and Columbia, Maryland, also tried to revive some of these ideas from the Garden City, including the use of commons that grew out of these earlier planning ideals. You can see here curvilinear streets, clustered housing, especially in that upper left image. You can see the green belts in the example in the upper right, where there's still a private space. Here you see some fences around individual properties, but then they overlook a commons, basically. Also communal amenities, in this case, a horse stable was one feature at Reston. And then finally, community villages. So this is the Lake Ann village that is at the heart of Reston, which is not unlike Forest Hills Gardens. It's not unlike Shaker Square in that sense. It's kind of a central focus. And we could add, I think now, the Van Aken district in Shaker. So for anyone who looks at that and thinks, oh, well, that doesn't seem like that's really like Shaker Heights. That seems like it's trying to be something different. Well, you can point to this and say, well, it actually in some ways does build upon that Garden City concept in a sense by having that concentrated civic space and commercial space. In addition to the aesthetics and the separation of land uses, I think we should also point to a third component of park suburbs, and that is social exclusivity. There's a long tradition of that that is deeply entangled with this type of development. And as Robert Fogelson, another historian, argues in his book, Bourgeois Nightmares, which I've shown here, developers of larger suburban allotments borrowed an innovation from England, the restrictive covenant. To understand why, we need to look at both developers and buyers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of developers took up developing larger, more fully planned suburban subdivisions. So they spent a lot of money laying out and paving streets, arranging for the provision of utilities, even building some or all of the homes. So where hundreds or even larger numbers of lots were to be sold, a developer might expect to be interested in the condition of the subdivision for several years or even sometimes longer. Where buyers were more affluent, they too would want greater control over how the lots around their own would be developed and used by other buyers. So it was all about property values. But it was not just simple demand at work here. Developers actively cultivated the idea that by buying in the quote unquote right suburban development, buyers might be guaranteed not only the enjoyment of a delightful naturalistic environment like that prescribed by Frederick Hall Olmsted, but also the assurance that their investment would be preserved and, importantly, would rise in value. Developers advertise lots as opportunities to invest for future profit, not unlike buying stock. Restrictive covenants seemed to be the answer to how developers might accomplish their goal to profit and to ensure that buyers would keep buying. Restrictive covenants had been used in England in the mid-18th century by nobility who leased lots on their estates, so it was not a new idea. By the late 18th century, they were also starting to be used in the early United States to preserve the character of fashionable neighborhoods in a select few cities. For example, we have two here, Boston's Lewisburg Square and New York City's Gramercy Park. But these restrictions did not yet have anything to do with race, nor were they used widely before the 1890s. Moreover, few restrictive covenants extended past the time the developer held the land and also carried no real plan for their enforcement. Restrictive covenants remained objectionable to many in the 19th century because they ran counter to long-held beliefs in the sanctity of property rights and home ownership. Then something happened to change a lot of minds. The late 19th century brought a swift rise of downtown development that quickly destroyed the character of once fashionable elite residential areas. A growing number of affluent urbanites began to wish for greater permanence. The breakthrough came in Baltimore with the development of Roland Park, which was a subdivision in 1891. As the historian Paige Glotzer details in her 2015 Journal of Urban History article and her 2020 book, How the Suburbs Were Segregated. Initially, restrictions did not include the exclusion of African Americans or any other groups. Roland Park's developer, Edward Bouton, considered a racial covenant at the outset, but was advised against it by his lawyers. Kansas City developer J.C. Nichols learned of the early success of restrictions and decided to use them in his country club district development in the Missouri city. Restrictions caught on pretty quickly all over the country as a result of professional networks among developers. But again, not always with the racial covenants. They were protecting against all sorts of land use considerations, what people could and couldn't do with their property. Nichols advised others that restrictive covenants were most appropriate for upper and upper middle class developments, and less stringent one, and he wanted less stringent ones with shorter periods before expiration would, because he thought those would be more attractive for middle class and working class home buyers who might be less willing to have limitations on their right to do with their property as they pleased. As Becky Nicolaides has argued in her book, My Blue Heaven, Torrance, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, was a place where developers found that working class buyers were not particularly concerned about the presence of factories, saloons, gas stations, self-built homes, or things like keeping chickens, rabbits, and goats on your property, because they viewed these homes not as the last stop, but more as a way station toward a home somewhere once they had hopefully saved more money. Design review procedures were uncommon at first because developers seldom wanted to administer them, but eventually these became more common, especially after they were instituted in Shaker Heights in the 19-teens, not 20-teens. In addition to seeing racial restrictive covenants as unnecessary in the pre-Great Migration era, developers also tended to fear that these might be illegal. They worried that if a racially restrictive covenant got contested in the courts, all restrictive covenants might be reviewed and possibly invalidated, which would be a disaster in their minds. So by 1913, in the wake of challenges against Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance of 1910, which was briefly a model for many cities in the South and the Midwest, Roland Park instituted its own racial covenant for the first time. So again, this is 1913, and it follows some early challenges against the Baltimore municipal residential segregation ordinance of 1910. So Roland Park instituted this racial covenant, and then many subdivisions across suburban America began to follow suit as the Great Migration stirred white concerns about the impermanence of so-called white neighborhoods. Depending on the location, the restrictions targeted Black, Jewish, Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, and sometimes other groups of people. In the Cleveland area, for instance, the 1920s saw several examples of Black professionals trying to buy homes in affluent areas, which again led to that idea of impermanence that, that really stoked white rage. Dr. Charles Garvin's newly acquired home on Wade Park Avenue, for example, in the Wade Park allotment in what's now called University Circle, got bombed twice in 1925 and 1926. And you can see that both him and the home, which is still standing today on Wade Park Avenue. It's on the south side of the street, kind of backing up to the backs of houses that are on Magnolia Drive. To stop and think about that for a moment. And secondly, around the same time, there was Dr. Edward Bailey, of course, in Shaker Heights, who faced incessant threats around that time when he and his wife purchased a home on Huntington Drive. So although the US Supreme Court was on the cusp of ruling in favor of racial restrictive covenant enforceability in the Corrigan versus Buckley decision in 1926, Shaker Heights took a somewhat different path, not using an explicit racial covenant, but rather one that would accomplish similar ends in a different way. The Bailey incident helped persuade many Shaker residents to agree to a new restrictive covenant that, while not explicitly mentioning race, nonetheless effectively barred anyone that Shaker Heights residents might see as unwelcome. The Shaker historian who I see is here, Virginia Dawson, has written extensively on this and has an article in the 2019, one of the 2019 issues of the Journal of Planning History that really goes into depth on the, on the contextualizing the Van Swearingen restriction. This particular restriction required that a home buyer obtain the approval of a majority of the nearest 21 property owners if petitioning for a waiver of the developer's choice to deny a home sale. So it continued over a course of many years after the mid-1920s to make it very difficult for Blacks and in some places also for Jews to acquire homes in Shaker Heights. And the restriction continued to be enforced in much of the city of Shaker Heights into the early 1950s, well after the US Supreme Court ruled against the enforceability of actual racial covenants in the Shelley versus Kramer decision of 1948. Because again, the Van Swearingen restriction made no explicit mention of race, and so it was not subject to the terms of Shelley versus Kramer. The use of deed restrictions, I think, gives a sense of the extent to which park suburbs or garden suburbs borrowed the aesthetic design principles of the rural cemetery, urban park, and garden city movements, but did not share Olmsted's belief that such environments might both appeal to and shape people of all backgrounds and conditions. But we would also, I think, do well to reflect on how the early rural or garden cemeteries set themselves at great distance from the urban masses and imposed strict rules to guard against many of the leisure activities that their beauty invited. This particular slide shows a guide to Mount Auburn Cemetery from the early 1850s, and it may be hard to read, but with a small print, but it spells out the various things that one was not allowed to do. And I think if you kind of read between the lines a little bit, you can see that in some of these instances, there are things, of course, that on the surface you think, oh, well, of course no one should do that in a cemetery. But they suggest that there might be the wrong sort of person who might, use this park-like space. So it's on the one hand, this is opened up and encouraged to be almost a proxy for a park. And that's really what these cemeteries were early on, is not just burial grounds, but they were proxies for the parks that generally did not exist in most cities. They were the lungs of the city at a time when people believed that fresh air was literally healing or preservative of health. So, I bring this up as one example of how these traditions, I think, were kind of laced with an exclusionary mindset from the very beginning. I think we'd also do well to reflect back on how Central Park itself displaced an African-American settlement known as Seneca Village in the mid 19th century as this was being laid out. And on the fact that for decades, the park was actually, despite its name, very distant and difficult to reach for New York City's immigrant and minority communities until the Great Migration sped Harlem's growth as a Black neighborhood on the northern end of Central Park in the 19 teens, especially, and after. So gradually it did move toward becoming more central and more usable by a more diverse population, but that was really not the case early on. It was a very waspish park for a while. Rural cemeteries, urban parks, and park suburbs began paradoxically with both communitarian principles and exclusionary practices. Only with time and determined effort did the communitarian spirit begin to diminish the exclusive inclinations of earlier generations who guarded these special places. And I will stop there and say thank you and take any questions that anyone may have.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I honestly got really enjoyed it. I love looking at all those pictures, and I think that it provided a really good foundation, and it's a good comparison between Shaker Heights and our Garden City to nationwide Garden City movements. So thank you so much for sharing your research and your time and your expertise with us. Now I'm going to open it up to anybody that has any questions. Please feel free to type them into the chat, and I will do my best to kind of field them at the same time. But I am going to use this time briefly just to kind of shamelessly plug a few of our upcoming events while we're waiting on some questions. This Friday, we actually have an exhibit opening. It is our Juneteenth quilt exhibit that is going to be opening up in our Lissauer Gallery, which is on our second floor of the Shaker Historical Society. And that is going to be featuring the African American Quilt and Doll Guild. They have made lovely, genuinely lovely and creative Juneteenth quilts to celebrate and remember Juneteenth. So that is happening this Friday, the 18th from 6 to 8 p.m. at SHS, so at our museum. And then Saturday, we actually have speakers. Some of the artists that are featured in the exhibition are going to be speaking on Saturday, Juneteenth, which is also June 19th, and that is starting at 1 p.m. and will be going through 3 p.m. So if you're interested in anything like that, please stop by. It is a free event, so feel free to stop by. But I don't see any comments or questions in the chat. But again, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Souther, for spending your evening with us. I know that it's a busy time of year and it's summertime. Everyone wants to get out and enjoy this lovely weather that we're having today. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Souther, for a very fascinating talk tonight. And again, this was recorded, so this will be available on YouTube for everyone to enjoy.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm going to